Thanks for listening to Baxie's Musical Podcast. If you like what you hear today, be sure to like it, follow it, share it, give it a big fat review. You can also follow the show on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok for regular updates and upcoming guests. Today, we're brought to you by Metro Chrysler Dodge Jeep Ram at Chicopee. Be sure to stop by their state-of-the-art dealership next to BJ's and Big Y, or stop by MetroJeep.com and make it Metro, and then drive home in your new Metro Chrysler Dodge Jeep Ram today.
It's Baxie's Musical Podcast. Resistance is useless.
So here's a question that's totally designed to start arguments, fistfights, and red-faced disagreements. What is the greatest rock song ever written? I have my own thoughts, but if you wanted to use the experts as a reference, then I suppose you could start with Rolling Stone's 2024 list of the top 500 songs of all time. According to that list, the greatest song ever is 1967's Respect by Aretha Franklin. Some would argue that the greatest song is 1967's A Day in the Life by the Beatles. Paul McCartney would tell you that the greatest song ever written was God Only Knows by the Beach Boys in 1966. Brian Wilson would tell you that the greatest song was 1963's Be My Baby by the Ronettes. Regardless of who you want to believe, everybody has a different opinion, and depending on who you're talking to, everybody else is wrong. The bottom line is, it's an impossible question to answer, and yet, some suggested titles do make you want to punch somebody right in the face. However, there are some people who by their very nature command enough respect that if they say, this is the greatest song I've ever heard, then there's a pretty good chance it probably doesn't suck. In fact, there's probably a pretty good chance it's a really great song. But whether something happens to be the best, that's an argument that you're never going to win. But then you have the late John Peel, whose influence over music on the BBC is perhaps without equal, having spent more than 40 years exposing his loyal British audience to a wide array of music, everything from prog, electronica, punk, and experimental underground music. From 1967 until his death in 2004, nobody in the UK was more vitally crucial in promoting new music than John Peel. Nobody. Then on September 25th, 1978, John Peel received a copy of a 4-song EP from a relatively unknown band from Northern Ireland in the city of Derry. The name of the band was the Undertones, and on that night, John Peel played the opening track entitled Teenage Kicks. In just 2 minutes and 22 seconds, the song moved John Peel to such a degree that he decided to play it twice, back to back. The legend goes that after the first listen to the song, John Peel broke down in tears. And after playing the song a second time, he told his audience that it just doesn't get any better than this. In fact, John Peel was so enamored with Teenage Kicks by the Undertones, he had the song's opening line chiseled on his gravestone. In his view, Teenage Kicks was the greatest rock song ever written. Was he right? Hard to say, but it's a pretty good guess, though. And that endorsement by John Peel led to the Undertones becoming legends. The Undertones would go on to record 4 full-length records over the next 5 years. They would release 13 singles, including My Perfect Cousin, Jimmy Jimmy, Wednesday Week, It's Gonna Happen, and several others. But it was Teenage Kicks that endured the test of time. There have been at least 2 documentaries produced about the Undertones, and in 2016, Undertones bass player Michael Bradley released his wildly entertaining memoir, Teenage Kicks, My Life as an Undertone. This year, the book has been re-released by Omnibus Press. It's a story that details the history of the band, where they came from, how they went from playing in living rooms to recording one of the most iconic punk rock songs of all time. This is my conversation with Michael Bradley from the Undertones on Baxie's Musical Podcast. I've read a lot of books for this podcast over the last 6 years, probably more books than I've ever read in my entire life, but I loved the hell out of this book.
Thank you very much.
I mean, not just because it's a great story, but because it is probably one of the most self-effacing and hilarious autobiographies that rock biographies that I've ever read.
Right.
And I think it's so refreshing to not hear the same kind of rock star biography.
Oh, yeah.
So I got to congratulate you. It's so beautifully written and so much fun to read.
Thank you very much. That's us off to a good start. So.
Yeah. Well, I'll throw you more compliments if it'll make you feel better.
I'll put them in a little bag and I'll carry them around with me.
It's interesting because when I'm reading the book, there's a part of me as I'm kind of trying to put myself into the story, where like I'm thinking, this is the kind of band that I would want to be in, rather than the band that there's a fantasy about it. I mean, you're in a band with literally your best friends, and it starts off that way, it ends that way. It's really pretty remarkable story when you're talking about five people getting together and then sharing success at the same time. What do you attribute that to? Is it just a matter of knowing each other for your entire lives, or is it something different than that?
I think it was I was very lucky, and you said it was self-effacing, but sometimes there's a good reason for someone to be self-effacing. But I was very lucky in that John was in the band, and John was kind of the originator of it, and John had a great talent, great taste, and John had a great talent for writing songs. And we were really, really lucky to get Fergal as a singer.
Hmm.
Somebody who technically is a great singer, but also, he wasn't in any other bands before. He didn't have a template or anything like that, or he wasn't really trying to copy anybody. It was really original,
Yeah.
and that helped. And then we'd Billy, the drummer, who's as well as being a great drummer, was a great kind of almost. I hope he never hears this. Almost naive willingness to go and try anything.
Right.
Yeah, let's do this now. Let's get. I remember once Billy says, this is obviously like 1977, 76, 77. He said, if we ever make a record, we should get John Lennon to produce it. And, the rest of us just look at him and go, yeah, sure, Billy. So having those three in the band, and then getting Damien as well, who's great guitar player. And I think that's what it was, really. And none of us had ever been through a band full stop. That's not even to say none of us had ever been through a bad experience with the band. With us, we never even saw that many bands either, Mike, because we were in Derry. We had local bands, but we rarely went along to see, the latest great band from London or so on, because they never came to Derry because of the troubles that were happening. So we had this idealized vision of what a band should be through reading the NME, New Musical Express, which is the main music paper that we read every week. So that's what we believed. We believed everything we read. And then when we read about punk rock, and we read, oh, this means that people like us could be in a band, and everybody's really kind of down to earth. All the other people in bands are really down to earth. We believed all that too. It was only when we met some of them that we realized, oh, it's not like it said it was in the NME. So that's kind of we were lucky to be in a good place at the right time.
There's a part of the story in the book where you talk about you guys are thinking in terms of yourselves as a band before anyone picked up a musical instrument, before anyone decided what kind of music you wanted to play. It was just like,
Yeah,
we're going to be a band. And,
absolutely.
and
Yeah,
that's how it
that's what it
starts.
was.
Yeah.
It was, I always say it was theory for the first year or so. It was complete and utter theory, but it was, we really believed in it, when we were even paying money into like a band pot, just to just to buy a microphone. I remember once we went into a music shop in Derry and we bought a microphone. This is a big deal for us. We didn't have anything to plug it into. We just thought, right, we've got a microphone. I remember still, it was £15 in a music shop called Dairies in Derry, which is no longer there, of course. So little things like that was another little staging
Yeah.
post for us.
When I talk about how many so many of these books that I've read, especially bands that had brothers in it, and obviously you got
Oh
the
yeah.
O'Neill brothers involved.
Mm.
It's like this sibling rivalry tends to be this poisonous undercurrent for so many
Yes.
other bands, and it
Yeah.
never seemed
Ray
that way with
Davis
the
and
O'Neills.
Dave.
Yeah.
No, of course not. I think if they'd ever fallen out, their mother would have slapped them around the head. No, there was none of that at all.
Yeah.
I never thought about that. There was no sibling rivalry at all. I'm sure at some stage over the many years, I'm sure John would raise an eyebrow at what Damien does, and Damien would raise an eyebrow at what John does. But no, they're still very close. And all the O'Neill family are really tight. Every so often they have a get together, and they apart from Damien, who lives in London, all John and his brother, and his two brothers and his sister all live in the same housing estate in Derry.
Really?
At
Still?
Moore Park, yeah, yeah.
Wow.
They've all got houses there. They are all literally 100 yards away from each other,
I love
and I find that amazing.
I love the fact that you mentioned that the fact that the O'Neills' mother wouldn't have put up with this. I think of like Ray and Dave Davies or the Gallagher brothers.
Yeah,
Where are the parents in this situation?
exactly, exactly. I blame the parents.
I
Yes.
do too. One of the things that comes across in the book, and I've talked to other. A few years ago, I talked to Jake Burns from Stiff Little Fingers, and we talked a little bit about the
Yeah. Yep.
troubles in Northern Ireland. And I mean, as a kid, you're surrounded by all of this, and I'm sure in some ways you see the horror of it, but then in some ways you also see this is just a part of everyday life. In some cases, the violence and the rioting, and amidst all of the things that go on. But interestingly enough, when it comes to the Undertones, you guys aren't writing about the political issues that are going on. You're really talking about things that are universal, like growing up and being a kid and being interested in girls. I mean, those are things that those are universals, and I think it's hard for
Yeah.
some people who've grown up in Northern Ireland to really understand what that was all about. Tell me a little bit about that experience, and drawing the difference between the music you play and the life you're living in a town like Derry.
Yeah. Well, you see, the it wasn't like, like there's so many examples you could use nowadays of what life is like now. Whether it's in Iran or Ukraine. It wasn't like that. There was violence. It would have been sort of more what you would get in cities in the United States. There were shootings and so on. Ours had a more political reasoning for it. So
Right.
there would have been that. But it's the old cliche: life goes on. And life did go on for us, and we lived in an area where most of a lot of the incidents happened. Like Derry was kind of still relatively small town, but that's where things like the first civil rights march in Northern Ireland, which was attacked by the police, that's where that happened. That's where Bloody Sunday happened. We had Martin McGuinness, one of the famous IRA men, and so on. So that was all happening, and that was all happening within our streets. And we all knew people from school who were actively involved in it, or people who just went down and threw a few stones and so on. It was kind of part of your life, but it's not the only thing in your life. John would be still fairly political, but uh, you know, as well as that, he bought records all the time. He read about bands all the time, and we all did that. So it's a difficult one to say because people kind of say, "Oh well, the Undertones they were doing this as a way to deal with the troubles." It wasn't at all. You just wanted to be like the Remotes. You just wanted to make records and to play shows that would be great. And then as well as that, then you read the news and we all had our views on what was happening and so on. But you know, they they do they do coexist. That's I'm sure no matter where, but England in the Second World War, people were still having relationships and people were still having relationship problems. There is that. But having said that, there was at some stage whenever John started writing songs, we kind of talked a little about writing songs about the troubles because we were never that fans of Such Little Fingers, especially. And I think I remember saying something about, that it's be really difficult to write a great song about what was happening in Northern Ireland. I think Bob Dylan would have had trouble with it. So there was that kind of thing happening as well. I certainly I wasn't not that much of a songwriter, but I did a wee bit. But I could never imagine writing, "Whoa, this is the song. This is the Troubles equivalent of the times they are a changing here," or
Right.
Masters of War. Didn't happen, and then but it wasn't an issue until we got a little bit of success, and then journalists would say, "You don't write about the Troubles," and then we went, "That's true. Yeah, we didn't.
Yeah.
We don't."
Well,
From
I think one of the things that people sometimes forget when they may be, critical or even question why you didn't sing more songs about the troubles. Ultimately being in a band is supposed to be about having some fun with your friends.
oh yeah,
And,
Yeah.
sometimes, that seems to kind of get overshadowed a little bit. I mean, in 30, 40 years, I can't say that I've ever seen U2 have fun. They don't look like a band that's having a great time. They look like they're dour and depressed and cashing checks. I mean, that's what it
Yeah,
it it
well,
seems
yeah,
like for
yeah.
them.
There is that too. They can't walk down the street. To
Right, of
be fair,
course. You know,
yeah, it's a good point.
Obviously much of the legend of or the story behind the Undertones revolves around teenage kicks. And I know
Yeah.
that it wasn't necessarily a hit when it first came out, but it certainly did have a life of its own.
Oh
I
yeah.
mean, 2 minutes and 22 seconds of music, changes your whole life. And, the
Mhm.
legacy of it has grown over the last 48 years. And clearly in the book, you guys never saw this coming. Like it was a surprise to you that this thing had legs and that people wanted to hear more from the Undertones as your first single out the gate.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, we it was all downhill from there. Um, no, well, I don't think that is it's a line. Just yeah, you're right. It happened so easily for us as well, despite the fact that we didn't have any contacts, and despite the fact that there wasn't a studio in Derry where you could go along to record anything. That we did a demo in a studio in a university, which is really used, I think, for language and all that. But there was no Derry had a history of music in terms of traditional Irish music and the show bands, and bands playing top 40 covers and all that. But they'd no real there was no story or no history of making records in Derry.
Right.
So, even whenever it came to us, we had to go to Belfast to do it. So we didn't pass anyone, or there's no one we could have seen in the streets of Derry to say, oh, they've made a record. They've made a great LP. Couldn't happen, whereas in London or even in Belfast to some extent, you could have done that. So maybe that's why we weren't expecting it. As I said, it gets back, it always, for me, sometimes it always comes back to reading the NME and reading about all these bands. But when you read about something in a paper and you don't see it face to face, it has a certain like mysterious quality to it. So it would never ever have occurred to us that if we made a record, we could get on Top of the Pops, which was the main UK music show, or that John Peel would play it and play it and play it. It just didn't happen. So when it did happen, it was so wonderful for
Yeah.
us. There was no struggle. We just kind of, oh, this
It,
is how it happened. This is great.
it's funny because the instant gratification is of music is very different when you're playing it live as opposed to when you've
Mm,
recorded something, or even it's very much like radio in a lot of ways. I mean, you can do a great show on the radio but not understand who's listening or how it's being received until months later, or if ever. You may never know. So when it comes to something like Teenage Kicks and that first EP, that 4-song EP that you guys put out, there's no way to know how it's being received until you have a moment like John Peel,
yeah.
gets it in his hands. I mean, that's such an important part of this whole story. How did he get his hands on that?
The strange thing was you mentioned Jake Burns there,
Yeah.
and Stiff Little Fingers. Their first single, "Suspect Device," came out. I think was maybe around about January or February 1978. By this stage, we had been trying to get demos, and we had kind of late a couple of months after that we would have sent demos to some English record companies. But whenever we heard um, Stiff Little Fingers on the John Peel show, because John loved Suspect Device, of course. Whenever we heard that, we immediately thought, what's this? This there's a band in Belfast who have a record, and that when we were shocked by this. Where's as I said, where's our record? So what happened then was that Billy, who would be a great Billy would be a go getter. Billy rang up John Peel. He rang the BBC in London and says, "Can I speak to John Peel?" And you couldn't do it now, but he was put through to Peel's office, and Peel answered the phone. And Billy says, "John, just to let you know, we're a band in Derry, and with the Undertones, I know you play stuff with the fingers, but there's another band we're called the Undertones, and we're in there." Anyway, he went, "Well, that's good. That's good to hear. Yeah, that's good to hear." And then I think he says, "Okay," and I think he mentioned us then. He mentioned, "Oh, just I got a phone call from band from a band in Derry. So there was that, and then Billy then would occasionally would ring up and ask John would he mention some of our friends on his show, and then at some stage then we'd even recorded the Peel show, and we played the bit where he mentioned people in our friends. We played that at our shows. So he knew of us, and he obviously he must have been some kind of charmed by
Yeah.
Billy doing this, and also mystified by the accent because you know, he could not understand the accent half the time. So we had that. And then whenever we made the record with Terry Hooley's label in Belfast, and I remember Damien and myself, we were posting it, we were up there folding the covers and all that. And then we put some of them into the cardboard envelopes. And I remember posting it to John Peel, BBC. So he got it and he listened to it. He told me about a year or so later, he says that he had all these records at home and he was having a session of listening to the records. And while he was doing this, his wife, Sheila, would walk in and out of the room, going about her domestic business. But I remember him telling me that whenever Teenage Kicks was on, she kind of stopped and says, "That's a good one." She said, "That's a good one." So maybe there was a bit of that as well. I heard the story many times later, many years later, I mean, a couple of years ago, and I'm sorry to indulge me in this, but whenever Nancy Sinatra was working with Lee Hazelwood, and they were working on songs, and Lee came over to the house, she was living with her daddy. Frank was there. And he says, well, Frank says, well, I'll be handy with, I'll be away down here, presumably in the other part of the big house. And Lee and her were working through songs. And then Lee went, and Frank was sort of passing Nancy and says, the one about the boots, that's good. So I think there might have been a wee bit of domestic thing, it's like, oh, my father liked the boots song, and maybe John Peel went, oh, Sheila likes Teenage Kicks.
Teenage
It might have been a bit of that. Absolutely, yeah. Oh, boots and kicks, yeah, very good.
The story behind it, though, John Peel plays it, and the legend goes he loved it so much he played it a second time, and
Yeah.
and then the story then gets even bigger by the first time he hears it, he breaks down in tears, and then it just snowballs like the legend of this song. You wonder how much of it is real and how much of it is just fantasy. But I mean, the reality is he didn't just like this song. He loved this song. I think when you put somebody else's lyrics on your gravesite, it's a pretty good indication that's a pretty good song.
Yeah, he did like it, and I can now look back on it, objectively and say, yeah, it's a great record. It is. It really does sound great. It's not too fast, not too slow. The guitars sound great. The philosophy of it, if there is one, is great about how it doesn't get any better than teenage love, But it just things like that then just keep a bit of momentum because it's like occasionally in newspaper articles now, we see the phrase "teenage kicks," usually to do with football, soccer, a bit of that, and it's kind of it's part of the everyday language almost. That kind of helps as well.
One of the parts of the book that's really interesting is like, so once this song comes out and, and then you got the single, now it's all like, you're all looking at each other like, well, no, what do we do now? And it was like, there was like this innocence about, a lot of people say, well, if you get one hit, you got to try on another. And it just seemed like it almost, it didn't occur to you right away that that was probably the thing to do.
No, although I think we did see it as once we got involved with Sire Records, like Seymour was in London, Seymour Stein was in London at the time. He heard it in Peel, so he sent his London guy over to Derry and all that. But once we'd signed with Sire, I think especially for John and Damien, it was Billy too. But it was we can make an LP now. So that was a big deal for us. We can. This is what we always wanted to do. We're going to be able to make records of these songs that we've been playing in pubs in Derry, And then after that, we, because we famously signed a really, really bad deal with Seymour, it was before we had a manager. So, but and once we got a manager, a guy who was actually the promotions guy for Sire at the time, on a freelance basis, and he realized when he met us, these guys are going to drown. They will be eaten up. So he was only about maybe 4 or 5 years older than us, but he was worldly wise. A guy, great guy called Andy Ferguson,
Yeah.
and he went to see Seymour and says, "Right, Seymour, I'm looking after him now." He says, "Well, need to read. It's not worth them making records with this record contract that you gave them." So we got that. But once we were over the initial kind of, what, we're now we now we're now a pop group. After that, everything was just brilliant.
Yeah.
It's hard to explain, because, as I said, it came quickly. And first of all, as Damien and myself, whenever I used to call into his house and walk down into town, and we always used to say, we don't have to work. This is our job. Now we don't have to go to either college, or we don't have to work in the office that we were doing. So there was a bit of that. We still loved that. Just stop and smell the roses here. Especially for the first couple of years, it was we are a band that you read about in the NME. So that was absolutely brilliant.
I want to talk about the Top of the Pops here for a second, because you mentioned that just a few minutes ago, and it certainly plays a pretty big role in your story, but in the story of a lot of others, the importance
Yeah.
of Top of the Pops and what that does. Yeah, I think it's hard for Americans to kind of get a sense of what an appearance on Top of the Pops would
Hmm.
mean. I think the closest we had here in the States would probably be American Bandstand, but even that is a very, very pale comparison. Tell me about the importance of that for any musical artist, to have that kind of exposure, even if you're, lip syncing your way through your biggest hit. The exposure you have, there's no amount of money in the world that could pay for that.
No, and also it was really, really gratifying to be on it, because you have to go back to the time, and this is where the UK was very different from the USA, is that there were only three stations. Now, in America you had the three. I think you had the three nationwide stations, but you also had lots of little local stations. Nothing like that. Nothing like that in the UK. There was three stations, and that was it. And Top of the Pops being on BBC on a Thursday night, prime time. And it was where even if you weren't a music fan, you watched it because you watched television, and there's a 1 in 3 chance that you would be watching this station. So you watched that. But of course, it also had the history of where the Beatles were on, Rolling Stones were on, David Bowie, Mark Bolan, everyone nowadays of a certain age can remember at least one performance of some band on Top of the Pops that they go, "It was brilliant," and they talked about it in school the next day. So it was bigger than the sum of its acts. It was just a huge thing, and for us to go on to it without trying to. I keep saying this, and this is really terrible. Without trying too hard, without any any element of struggle, or any element of really hard work. We made this record. He liked it. Seymour heard it, and suddenly we were asked to go on Top of Pops. Died and gone to heaven, Mike.
Yeah.
Died and gone to heaven. That's what we were.
You know, that experience of being on Top of the Pops, plus the Peel show, plus to sign with Sire Records. So, three major,
Very cool record label. Yeah.
very cool record label at the time. Obviously, you're gaining this reputation, certainly around the UK. But when you go back home to Derry with all this, and there's so much going on, in Derry and Northern Ireland. I mean, what was the reaction at home when these things were happening to you?
Well, the most immediate reaction was, Top of the Pops, as I said, was on Thursday night, and the following day we were booked to play in a bar in Derry called the Rockin' Chair, and it was just a small bar, and that's where we would have seen occasional top 40 bands. So we were booked to go there, which was great because it gave us the opportunity to say to Sire Records, because they wanted us to stay in London and do some support acts and do some support appearances and do this and do that. We was no, we got to go home. we got to go home to Derry because we're supposed to be playing in the rocking chair tomorrow night. So we know what that sounds like, and we enjoyed the sound of that. But whenever we went in, because it took a bit of a time, for us to get from the airport on Friday and get into Derry, and we walked into the bar, and it was packed, with the family members of mine were there, and and everybody. You just knew this was like a homecoming, a
Yeah.
successful homecoming, And in fact, the local newspaper, the Derry Journal, they always had an entertainments page, which was a list of what bands were playing, what films were playing in which cinema, what band was playing in which bar, what dance was on in which dance hall, and they had their small classified ad. It said, the rocking chair last night, Top of the Pops, tonight the rocking chair, the Undertones. So it was all that. So that was the immediate one, and then after that, because back in those days, 1978, it, music coverage wasn't as mainstream as it is now. Nowadays, local TV, local newspapers, any element of being in a band, there's a story about them. Back then, there wasn't. Well, maybe because of the troubles, the papers had more important things, but it just wasn't part of news coverage the way it is now. So there was the occasional little story about the Derry band, the Undertones, success, blah blah blah, all that. But the rest of it was, older people would have thought, oh, isn't that great? Isn't that great to see somebody from Derry doing well? Like, fair play to them. And that's one of the Bradleys from Craig, one of the Bradleys, and O'Neill's from Beechwood Avenue. That's great because Derry is very, very close to that. But then the guys with the same age as us who didn't share our musical interests, they were not amused. A lot of those were not amused, and also it was an excuse to pick on somebody.
Right.
And Fergal was very easily recognizable, because he was a kind of not quite a strutter, but he was a very fast walker, and he was always upright, and he took no shite from anybody, and he would have been a very visible target, for guys shouting at him and occasionally wanting to take it further than that. So there was that too,
Well,
um
Well, it's funny because I've heard other interviews you've done where people have said, well, what was the music scene in Derry like? And the fact of the matter is there was no music scene in Derry. It was you guys and the Enemy
that
and
was
Top of the Pops, and that was
yeah.
pretty much it.
Yeah, we were the music scene in Derry, which is very unfair on all the other guys who played in bands that did Wishbone Ash songs or did Thin Lizzy songs. But in terms of band doing their own songs,
Yeah.
we were kind of the only ones doing it. Although very quickly, a lot of younger guys just obviously and inspired by us. Within a couple of months, there was about at least half a dozen groups, guys starting bands and all. And it was brilliant. It was really, really good to see. Of
Yeah. Well,
course, I was always very concerned to make sure that none of them were as good as us.
of course, of course.
Yeah,
But if the guys from the O'Neills, living room can do it, anybody can do it.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, you're right.
We talked about the friendship and the lifelong friendship between the O'Neills and everybody else, and then but in the book there's a part where you kind of talk about Fergal Sharkey kind of being an outsider of the group. Not that you
Mm.
guys weren't close, but that he was not in the thick of the friendship that the rest of you guys were in. How would you describe him in that dynamic? I mean, was he really an outsider, or was it just or was it something different?
Well, on the face of it, no, he was not an outsider because he did sit in the front room of O'Neill's. Like, he was a year or so after us in terms of he's a year older than me, but in terms of we were John and Billy were very very close for a couple of years, and I was a year after that. And that sounds like a very short period of time, but whenever you're like 15 or 16, being friendly with somebody for 6 months is kind of important. You're going, yeah, I knew him before you knew. So there was a little bit of that with Fergal, but there was a couple of years where we would just hang out. We would go to the cinema. He got a job with a company called Radio Rentals, who actually rented televisions. And because back in those days, and where we came from, if you had money, you could buy a TV, but usually people just rented a television because they were so expensive. So he had a job with them, which meant that he had a use of a small van with radio rentals on the side of it. So occasionally we would just climb into the back of that and go out and just buy chips, or buy hamburgers or whatever. It wasn't quite American graffiti. It would have been our version of that, just hanging out. So we were kind of we were close, but underneath it all, there was possibly a wee bit of he liked different music from us. Although he was the first one to buy Anarchy in the UK, he bought the Sex Pistols, and he loved Iggy Pop. But there was sometimes just a little bit of he had he had liked the Eagles longer than, or he had stopped liking the Eagles after we had all stopped liking the Eagles. A bit of that, which is ridiculous even to think about it now. And then he had Led Zeppelin records,
Right.
but so I don't know. It's over the course of about 2 or 3 years, then it just did start to get a little bit, not fractured, just a little bit divergent, possibly because the singer as well. The singer he does all the interviews. And if you do interviews, and I'm one to talk here, but if you do interviews and then the rest of the band read the interview and they weren't interviewed, they're not annoyed that they weren't interviewed, but it just means that there's going to be focus on what you say.
Sure.
You're almost speaking as a spokesperson for the band, and that's a dangerous thing, through no fault of his own. Whatever he said, whatever people said about him, it's the occasional ripple of discontent, within the band.
But even as you close out the book and you talk about the breakup of the band, I mean, even in spite of all of that, there seems to be very little. It wasn't an acrimonious divorce. It was just like, okay, well, we've done all we can do here, and it just seemed like, okay, the hits are not coming the way that we were hoping to, so let's just stop. I mean, it seemed like such a simple way to end, this very successful band. Just a very simple, okay, well, I'll see you next week.
I think that's the way a lot of bands did. Nowadays, bands don't really break up. Obviously, they do, but
Yeah.
Back then you kind of thought you had a shelf life, and if as you say, if the hits weren't happening, and you were making records and they weren't selling, and you started looking at what else could I do here. And we all did that at the same time. Fergal was the one who actually grasped the nettle and says, right, I'm leaving. And he then had a great career, a very successful career. John was very happy that it was over as well. I think he would just wanted to do something different. So he started, he went back to, we all went back to Derry, apart from Fergal and Damien. He went and he started a band called That Petrol Motion with some friends of his.
Yep.
Guys that he knew. And Damien and myself, I actually moved to London after we broke up, which is the weird thing, everything in the wrong order there. And I moved over there with Damien, and we had about a year, 6 months trying something, and it was just no good.
Yeah.
Did not work at all, and still terrible times. So we all had an idea that we would do something else, but it did just seem very natural that, the Undertones was, you have a couple of hits and then you break up.
Yeah.
That's what groups do. That's what bands do.
After everything was all said and done, and the band had broken up in 82, 83, I think. 83.
Yeah.
You eventually started a career in radio, working for the BBC. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, that was me. I was back home in 1985, and then I thought I would do what we have A levels here, which was like what exams that you got before you went to university, which I didn't. I failed. I failed mine, and I completely blamed the band. It was 1970, the summer of 78. So I kind of thought, well, I'll do a bit of that, and then I realized, this is not going to work. You're going to try and go to university, and you'll be 32 by the time you're out of university, which seemed terribly, terribly old. And I just kind of drifted into, there's a local radio station still here, of course, BBC Radio 5, and I still have a program on. And they were always, it was very community orientated radio station. They always wanted anybody who would be anyway good, try and just try out for it, you know. So I did that. And when I was there, it turns out that the manager, I knew this at the time, but he didn't realize that I was going to be coming through his door. The manager was a former teacher of mine.
Oh, really?
So yeah, so he kind of went, well, because I was a smart boy at school, and so he, and also he obviously knew about the band, so he says, right, get him to do some programs, and I just kind of think it was picked it up very quickly.
And you're still doing it now. How many years has it
So
been?
40 years, 40 years. I started
Wow.
there in 1986, and then I wasn't doing music programs for a long time. I was producing speech programs and doing this and doing that, and then I just, I knew that I was in the right place for my particular set of skills. I knew that I couldn't be in another band.
Right.
I wasn't going to try and create a musical career for myself. And also I liked living in Derry,
Yeah.
so yeah, it worked out well. Yeah.
Well, as someone who has had a radio career almost as long as you, in fact, just about as long as you, I know it is often the career people choose when there are no other appreciable skills. I don't know if it's the same thing in the BBC, but here in the States,
Yes.
that's what you find.
Yeah, we had several failed musicians in radiophile. That was the running joke amongst like one of the best broadcasters we ever had. He's no longer. He passed away about 10 years ago. A guy called Jerry Anderson.
Hmm.
He was just brilliant on the radio, but he was a bass player in the 1960s. He then played with. He went to Canada. He played with Ronnie Hawkins. You know,
Yeah.
host the band, obviously. So he knew all that kind of. He was involved in the fringes of that. That was the joke. Failed musicians join the queue.
The Undertones did eventually get back together. I think it was like
Yeah.
1999 or somewhere around there.
Yep.
And Fergal did not participate in that. Was there a
Yeah.
reason for that? Or I know he had moved on to like politics and and
Yeah.
other things. Was that really where his focus was at the time, or was it
I
something
think
different
so.
than that?
Yeah. It was kind of mutual because a couple of years before that, in fact, it was 1990, 1990. It would have been, or 1989, it would have been John Peel's 40th birthday then. And and we were approached about reforming to play at Peel's 40th. And we kind of went, yeah, okay. I think John had been out of that particular motion, so we did get together in London, and Fergal came along to the rehearsal, but he had a cold or something, so we didn't actually sing. So we were working a couple of rehearsing some songs. He was there. It was okay. It was all right.
Yeah.
It was okay. But then what happened was that John and Damien's father died suddenly.
Mm.
Louis O'Neill, who would have been a great character, and he died. So obviously it wasn't going to happen. So we went away, and I think, and then after that, there was another offer, but Fergal kind of says, "No, I wouldn't be. No, I don't want to do it. I'm now doing this, and so on." So we went. It's okay. So
Yeah.
that we didn't pick up that offer. Then 1999 came along, and we were friendly with Billy and myself were very friendly with the Saw Doctors, an Irish band who like big in Ireland at the time and still play the United States a lot. So they were fans of the band, and they asked would we come along and join in if they did Teenage Kicks. And I think the four of us all kind of went. Well, Billy was always up for it, and I knew the Saw Doctors as well. And Damien and John says, yeah, why not? And I remember whenever I heard that John was doing it, I was so happy. I thought, oh, brilliant, because I thought John would have says, no, no, don't. He went, and I always get the impression still that John kind of doesn't really want to be doing this, but he's been doing it for the last 25 years. And he comes off and he says, oh, that was great, and
Yeah.
he's still writing songs and all that. Still the same kind of thing, it's like I'm always expecting it to fizzle out. But,
But yet it still goes on. In fact, you guys are playing. It looks like your calendar is kind of full for the rest of the year, playing with like the Sex Pistols and Adamant and
Yeah.
the Ruts and Stiff Little Fingers. I mean, to be playing these songs, after all this time, at the pace you guys can choose to play, because it sounds.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not touring the world every single day or every single week. You're playing here, you're playing there, you're doing it, like you want to do it. It's got to be an absolute thrill to go back and see the reactions that people have to these great songs that you guys produced.
It is. Yeah, it really is. And it's that thing that I never really appreciated at the time, the joy of being on stage and playing an instrument and playing along with, the playing along with a band and getting it right, and it sounds great, and all that. I think I possibly took it for granted
Yeah.
when I was younger, But now I realize, and I can see people looking at it going, this is brilliant. And you go, we're making people very, very happy,
Yeah.
In fact, just like we hadn't played anywhere since December, and I took it upon myself to gather everybody together. I says, "Look, we should practice, or work on some old songs, new songs, or whatever." So, but there's Derry to this day still doesn't have a great rehearsal space and so on. So just like O'Neill's house, I set it up in our front room, in my front room, just last week, Mike. Pushed the sofas back, and got the small amps, and Billy got his drums, and Paul came up from Dublin, Damien came over from England. We had a great time.
You probably had people in the street saying, "Listen, these guys trying to be the Undertones."
No, hey, I realized we have good double glazing. No one turned either that, or people weren't interested. No, it was great. So and it is that it is that kind of thing that you still appreciate whenever you're playing, and Billy plays drums, John and it's like, this is really good. This is enjoyable, and also a good thing in its own. So yeah, long may it continue.
I hope so. Michael, like I said, I really enjoyed reading the book. It's the kind of book, I mean, I realize it's a biography, an autobiography of you and the band, but there's a part of me that says, is Michael Bradley ever going to write a second book? Because the first one was so much fun to read. So I don't know if there's another book in you, but I certainly hope that this was not the last time I get a chance to read a book of yours.
Well, you know what? While I haven't written it, the second book is potentially great. But so if I never write it, it's always going to be potentially great. Which is a terrible cop-out.
Maybe the biggest mistake you could do is actually sitting down and writing it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Michael, this has been a lot of fun and a real joy to talk to you. I've been a big fan for an awful long period of time, and so I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thanks very much.
Take care.
All right, Mike.
The name of Michael Bradley's book is called Teenage Kicks: My Life as an Undertone. It's been reissued by Omnibus Press. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, you can email me at bax@rock102.com. I'd love to hear what you think. Thanks to Metro Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, Ram, and Chicopee for their support, but most of all, thanks to you for listening to Baxie's Musical Podcast.